Welcome, everyone who's with us tonight, and we're glad to have you. And we're also glad to have Professor Marjoleine Kars with us, who is going to be talking about her study and including her book about the North Carolina Regulation, which came out unbelievably 19 years ago. It doesn't seem that long, but then again, it seems like it's always been around as the authoritative source. So welcome, Professor Kars, to our program tonight.
Thank you, John. It's great to be here.
Great. Okay, well, let me introduce Professor Kars to our audience. She is the Associate Professor of History at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. She is a Senior Editor for International Labor and Working Class History Journal and has received fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Historical Association, the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation, the American Philosophical Society, the John Carter Brown Library, the European University Institute, the Huntington Library, and UMBC. And as I mentioned, she is the author of a book called Breaking Loose Together. This is the Regulator Rebellion in pre-revolutionary North Carolina. And make sure you pick up a copy after the talk because it's wonderfully written. I don't want to embarrass Professor Kars, but it's wonderfully written on a favorite subject of mine. So thank you for being here with us this evening while you're on the road, and we're looking forward to talking to you about this subject.
Excellent. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, why don't we start with a broad question for folks who aren't that familiar with this period of North Carolina colonial history. What was the regulation or the War of the Regulation? It has a few different names, but can you give us an overview of what this episode was really about?
Sure. Some people may be familiar with it a little bit from a TV show, which I have forgotten the name of, but it's quite popular. It's a show about people who travel to the past.
Outlander,
anyway,
I think?
Outlander, yeah. I never saw it, but they interviewed me at some point because they were talking about the regulation. But the regulation was a farmers' movement that took place in the Piedmont of North Carolina, which was then called the backcountry, which had by the 1740s and 1750s, when colonists came to move into the North Carolina Piedmont from colonies to the north, Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and some came from further north than that. By then, the Piedmont had largely, Native Americans had largely been pushed out. And these farmers came to the Piedmont looking for cheap land, religious independence, and a good place to create a future for themselves and their families. And they were disappointed in those hopes. And we can talk, John, about why that was. And so the regulation was an attempt by these folks to organize and to create greater economic equality and democracy in North Carolina. They began to organize in the 1760s, 1766. They're remarkably successful in some ways in terms of organizing. They're not all that successful in getting results. And in the end, Governor Tryon, the royal governor of North Carolina, gets fed up with them, and he marches an army against them made up of militia from eastern North Carolina, and he defeats the regulators at the so-called Battle of Alamance in May of 1771. And then he takes a punitive march through the backcountry, destroying farms, requisitioning food and farm animals, and that really ends the regulation in North Carolina.
Great. So as you said, it was mostly focused, the unrest and the protests, mostly focused in Piedmont and the backcountry. Did any of the other colonies have similar regulation type movements prior to the revolution that were this size or scale or ultimately led to violence?
Nobody had regulation movements of the scale of North Carolina, but the kinds of issues that North Carolina farmers were concerned about, John, which was that it was difficult to obtain land cheaply, that it was difficult to obtain clear title to land, that it was hard for farmers to borrow. And as you know, farmers only get paid once a year when the harvest comes in. And during the year, if they need money for a sick child or a tool breaks, or they're hungry and they need food, they need to borrow money. And in the colonial period, there were no banks. And so people had to borrow from the richer members of the family or of the colony, and that created dependence. And so those kinds of issues, difficult access to land, having trouble paying their taxes, having trouble paying their debts, were issues that plagued farmers throughout the colonies and during the American Revolution and after. So during the Revolution, we see the whiskey rebels in Pennsylvania. Some of the viewers may be familiar with the whiskey rebels. People also call them the Regulation of Pennsylvania, Shays Rebellion in Massachusetts and New York, another regulation towards the end of the American Revolution. And before the American Revolution, there's certainly a lot of unrest among farmers in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, but nothing big and organized like the North Carolina regulation. It's really, in the revolutionary period, the largest uprising of free colonists in the entire colonial period, really.
Yeah. Where does the word regulation come from? Was it used at the time, or is that a term that scholars have since called the movement?
It's a term that was already used in 17th century England during the English Civil War. It was used by people who wanted to regulate their government, meaning that they wanted to ferret out government corruption. And I think that's very much the meaning that the North Carolina farmers intended by using that term. They wanted to regulate their government because they were upset about government corruption. So not only was it difficult to get land, but part of the reason that it was difficult to get land was because of corruption in the land office, the Royal Land Office, the land office in the Granville part of North Carolina. There were large land speculators in North Carolina, and we can talk about that, who milked people and made it difficult for them to get title. People had to pay high taxes, and a lot of that tax money was collected from them, but never made it into the royal treasury. And in fact, when the regulation is all over and Governor Tryon departs to become governor in New York, where he similarly fights with farmers, by the way, the sort of forerunners of Shays, the new governor, Governor Martin, writes home and he says, these farmers were right. There was a lot of embezzlement going on. They're also upset by the courts charging people high fees when they have to go to court, and they're worried about court corruption. And so what regulators want to do is clean up government, make their government less corrupt, more answerable to the people, and create a society in which free farmers can more easily succeed.
Mm-hmm. So how far back? Well, if we take the Battle of Alamance in 1771 as a starting or as an ending point, how far previously into back in the 1760s did these were the beginnings of this movement, the beginnings of unrest, and where maybe backcountry leaders or farmers started to say, hey, we've got to do something about that? How far back does that go?
Well, officially they organized in 1766, but already in the years before that, there's grumbling. There are one of the men who later becomes a spokesman for the Regulators and who's really their political ideologue. He sort of gives voice to their ideas and he writes them down. His name is Herman Husband. He already complains to Lord Granville, I believe, if I remember correctly. As you mentioned, I wrote the book a long time ago, but I recently reread it. But he already complains to Lord Granville, who owned a big part of North Carolina, sort of the northern half of North Carolina, in the late 1750s, saying things are not okay here. There's a lot of stuff going on in your land office, and you need to look into it, because he said, I recently went to the land office and I had all my neighbors gave me their information for me to look up whether they'd gotten their deeds. And there's at least 170 of them missing. I couldn't find any of these people. So people are unhappy, but the first stirring of the organization is really in the mid 1760s in a place called Sandy Creek, where farmers get together and organize what they call the Sandy Creek Association. And they have a couple of hotheads among them. And then some people like Herman Husband get involved and basically say, if we're going to protest, we need to do this right. We need to do it calmly. We need to think about it. And let's give ourselves this new name. And they start calling themselves the Regulators.
Interesting. Another aspect that I remember specifically from your book that really was kind of the first major study, I think, to get into this. But there was some religious denomination tension also, right? Where the colony was an Anglican one, Church of England, and yet a lot of these people pouring into the backcountry, in the 1750s and 1760s were not. They were Quakers, I think. How did religion figure into all this turmoil?
Yeah, religion is a big part of the book for me, because most of the folks coming into the backcountry were dissenters of the Anglican Church. They were, quite a few of them were Quakers indeed, members of the Society of Friends. There were quite a few Baptists, Presbyterians, lots of folks who were influenced by what historians call the Great Awakening, which was a religious movement that starts in New England in the 1730s, sort of slowly moves south, and is a movement in which people are revolting against a mode of religion that has increasingly become distant and formal, where you go to church on Sunday and you listen to a learned sermon, and you're not supposed to feel much or say anything, or and the Great Awakening is really a movement that brings people's personal experiences back in the church, and where the idea of a new birth, as it was called, a powerful experience of conversion, becomes really important to people. And so many of the people coming into the Southern backcountry are deeply influenced by the Great Awakening. So they are so-called New Light Presbyterians, for instance. These were Presbyterians who supported the Great Awakening. They are separate Baptists. They are Quakers who are not really influenced so much by the Great Awakening, but who, from the moment of their founding in England in the English Civil War, have been people who have been fiercely protective of their own conscience and their ability to know God directly, which is a big part of the Great Awakening too. So they're sympathetic. And then large numbers of people are free thinkers. They come into the backcountry precisely because they do not want to be part of an established church, because they have thought about religion a great deal, and they feel strongly and they agree strongly with adherents of the Great Awakening, who not only believe in this notion of a new birth, but believe very strongly that people don't really need a formal church hierarchy, that once you are converted, the Spirit of God lives within you, and that godly spark provides you with the internal guidance and the conscience and moral righteousness that you need to do the right thing in the world. And so many of these folks do not want to belong to any kind of formal denomination or formal church. Others, like the separate Baptists, and I saw somebody introducing themselves, a woman who said she was a descendant of Abram Creason, who is a separate Baptist assistant minister in the backcountry and becomes involved in the regulation. Separate Baptists are very much folks who don't believe in a church hierarchy. Every congregation picks its own minister. The minister does not get paid a salary. He lives on voluntary contributions by the congregation. And when people feel that a minister is not sufficiently spiritual and doesn't give sufficient evidence of having been reborn or seems to be backsliding, then they find a new minister. And so the backcountry has a religious climate that is contentious, that is free thinking, that is very intense. People are really seeking a place where they can live their lives according to their own religious beliefs. And that will play, I argue, a huge role in the regulation. And we can talk about how that worked.
Thank you. Getting to another one of the grievances, you hit on the grievances that they had in a couple of minutes ago as an overview. And all of my graduate work has been in North Carolina colonial history and Revolutionary War history. And one of the subjects that keeps coming up, excuse me, over and over and over again is the lack of money in the colony, the lack of hard currency, specie, and this was true of that period. And then the 1764 Currency Act came in, which really limited the ability of the backcountry people to pay their fees and their debts, as you mentioned, when they go into debt. How did that hit the regulators as far as the money issue, and what were they really, or did it seem like they were being squeezed by colonial officials or London officials for that matter?
Well, the shortage of money definitely plays a role. So North Carolina is a developing economy, particularly in the backcountry. So specie in the colonies is always scarce because the colonies are not allowed to make their own coin. So any hard money that comes into the colonies has to come through trade. But since the colonies are not self-sufficient, they buy a lot more from Britain than Britain buys from them. And so the drain of money is towards England, not towards the colonies. And then indeed, Britain limits the colonies in how much paper money they can print. And part of the reason North Carolina farmers are squeezed, not only in the backcountry, although they are mostly so, is because the government is calling in paper money, which they have printed, and then they decide that they need to retire that debt, because printing money is basically the government borrowing against future tax monies. And so they increase taxes so that they can retire that debt. And so people are doubly squeezed. They have trouble coming up with the money to pay their debts and their taxes because money is so scarce. And yet they are not allowed to pay their debts and their taxes in produce. So they have to find money. And then when they scrape that money together, so much of it never makes it into the treasury, as much as 60,000 pounds. And so they suspect, and they're right, that the local sheriffs and other officials are absconding with that money, are not paying it into the royal treasury. And so they're saying, we are scraping to get that money, and then you guys get rich of it. This is not how it ought to be. And so one of the demands of the regulators is a thorough accounting of tax monies, and at some point they even refuse to pay their taxes. That is to say, they collect the taxes themselves, but they say, until we can be assured that this money will end up where it's supposed to, we're going to hold on to it. So it's not like they don't want to pay their taxes, they're paying them, but they're collecting them themselves and then waiting for this accounting, which never happens, in order to turn over their tax monies.
Mhm.
Yeah.
One of the interesting things about the colonial period was that, unlike today, the sheriff was also the tax collector, and the sheriff was on, on the line to get everybody's money in, and then, as you say, supposed to turn it into the treasury. But this power of the sheriff is quite significant, as the tax collector. So who were these folk? Who were these sheriffs and the governor and attorneys, that were the subject of so much growing hostility to the regulators? What names keep showing up in
Mhm.
the records and as the villains, if you will, in this story, from the regulator standpoint?
Well, I'm glad you bring that up, John, and you're absolutely right that in the southern colonies, there is no town government, there is no county government. The local government are the local court and the sheriff. So the sheriff and the county clerk and the justices of the peace are the folks who make the government run on the local level. And these tend to be the more well-to-do members of the community, of course, and they often pay for their office. They pay somebody off. Elections are all by voice vote. So imagine that you need to get called up to vote. And of course, you've just had to borrow money from one of these guys. And now he says, okay, Mr. Maas, whom are you going to vote for? Surely you're going to vote for me, right? So elections are rigged that way. And then these local sheriffs and local justices of the peace are also the folks who end up in the North Carolina legislatures. So these folks start out as local officials, and then, just as is true nowadays, after they've done local government for a while, then they aspire to something bigger and they become legislators. On the provincial level, of course, the government is run by the governor, the royal governor, and his council, and then by the legislators, many of whom are indebted to these sheriffs for their elections, who have friends among these local officials. So it's really a hand-in-glove kind of thing. And we sometimes like to think that, Tryon is a royal governor and the regulators were opposing royal government. They're not really. The regulators are opposing local officials, and they are inspired in part by the patriots who are fighting the Stamp Act in 1765. And regulators say, whoa, we see our elite men, our leaders on the coast, fighting government corruption in England. That is a good thing. So surely you guys will agree that we kind of need to clean up house locally too. And the officials go, and no, that is not what we had in mind. We're fighting Britain. That is really corrupt. This local stuff is nothing. And so the regulators are inspired by radical Whig political thinking that justifies rebellion against Britain. And they're using those same ideas to argue that they want to clean up local government. And the folks on the coast are saying, no, you guys are misunderstanding how this political theory works. It's better if you leave the thinking and the politicking to us. And that is precisely where I think radical Protestant religion comes in, because radical Protestant religion tells people that God dwells within them and tells them how to act. And so I argue that people like Herman Husband combine this radical Protestant insistence on listening to your own conscience with radical political thought, which was being justified to rebel against government, because that radical Whig thought said that that a government is built on the consent of the people, and that if the government is corrupt and people try to change it and it doesn't work repeatedly, then ultimately people have a right to rebel. And that is those are the political ideas on which the regulators draw. But I think they get the sort of psychological freedom to do that, because after all, in the colonial period, ordinary farmers are not supposed to be politically active. They're supposed to be say yes and amen. And so I think that they get the psychological freedom and motivation to do this, in part from saying, okay, I may not be educated, but a piece of God dwells within me. And he helps me know what is the right thing to do. And so religion and politics, which are very closely allied anyway in the colonial period, particularly come together, I think, in the North Carolina regulation. And that's why it's such a fascinating movement.
So by 1769, the movement had grown to the point, and I guess had been stirred up to the point where the regulators issued resolves in order to try to fix what they saw were the problems in North Carolina. So what did these resolves call for? How do the regulators want to try to fix the system?
Well, they start by trying to talk to local officials. They invite them to come to a meeting, and these local officials, a famous one is named Edmund Fanning. He came from Connecticut. He was a man on the make. He was educated at Yale and Harvard and Columbia. He was a young, cocky kind of guy. He had many different offices in Hillsborough. He was a justice of the peace, I think, and he was register of deeds, and he had all kinds of political offices. He was badly hated by the regulators, and they invite him and a number of other officials to meet with them. And basically, people like Fanning say, you guys aren't good enough to meet with. We will not, condescend to come meet with a bunch of stinky farmers, basically. So then they begin to petition the legislators. And they get these petitions together, large numbers of people sign them, and they send them off to the legislators. That doesn't do anything. Then they send petitions to the governor. He's not willing to listen. Then they finally say, by 69 or so, maybe we need new legislators. Maybe we need to elect people with regulator sympathies to the legislative body. And that's a big step. And they do. And Herman Husband, who's one of their spokesmen, is in fact elected for Orange County, as are a number of other men. But they are a tiny minority in the legislature, and so they don't succeed in being able to do anything. And it's really after regulators have tried these legal means of affecting change, talking, petitioning, elections, that they get frustrated enough that they, on 2 different occasions, engage in rather limited violence, where they take over the courthouse in Hillsborough, and they say to the judge, you can either speak justice and we're going to help you, or you can leave and we'll do it ourselves. But we really do need justice, and we do need a court system that works. They eventually level. That was
that the Hillsborough riot?
That was the Hillsborough riot in 1770. There is a bigger one, and there is one in 68, a little bit earlier. In 1770, they level Fanning's house. They beat up a couple of officials, but it's relatively limited if you think about how much people have felt stymied and with how much contempt they have been treated. But the governor takes that riot in Hillsborough as an opportunity to try to crush the regulators once and for all. And so initially he can't do much, because what the regulators have done is not enough to charge them with rebellion or treason. And so he gets the legislators to pass what comes to be known as the Johnston Riot Act, which is a pretty draconian measure that allows the governor to get an army together and march to the backcountry and subject these people to military conquest in order to bring them to trial. And that is exactly what happens.
Sure. Well, let's start then talking about that part. When Tryon decided to raise forces, the Regulators were also forming and would eventually clash at the Alamance River. What kind of numbers are we talking about here as far as the number of folks that would be Regulators, not just the ones that showed up at the battle, but is there any sense that you have of how many backcountry folks would have called themselves Regulators?
I think that in the end, we think that the great majority of free men in the backcountry were either Regulators or Regulator sympathizers. Huge numbers of men, of course, only men, signed these petitions. And there is very good evidence to show that the Regulators are growing, not only in the backcountry, but they are sending, by the fall and winter of 1770, they are sending representatives to other counties further east and organizing there. And in fact, when Governor Tryon tries to call up the militia, he initially has a lot of trouble, because in various counties, even near Newbern, the militiamen come and they grumble and they're like, we don't want to fight against our brothers out west. We kind of think these guys are right on. And he has to put considerable pressure on militiamen to come and fight with him. And in his army, he has a disproportionate number of officers, because it is elite men in Eastern North Carolina who see the regulation as dangerous, because the Regulators attack elite economic and political power. And so by the time Tryon marches to the backcountry, his army is disproportionately made up of officers, and many of these men will, in 5 short years, lead North Carolina into the revolution. And so the North Carolina regulation shows us the extent to which the American Revolution is in many ways a conservative movement. It's a movement of elite men who want to gain more power vis-a-vis British merchants and British Parliament, who want a certain amount of autonomy and independence for themselves, who want an end eventually to a colonial structure, but who want to stay in charge. And who are very keen to defeat any movement from below that they think will threaten them. And so they walk a tightrope in the immediate years before the revolution. They need popular support for their revolution. They need people in the streets protesting the Stamp Act and the Boston Tea Party and all that kind of stuff. But they don't want ordinary people so riled up that they begin to want reform at home. And in North Carolina, that really gets out of hand. And so these patriots march against farmers who are using the same ideology as patriots are, to argue that they want greater autonomy and independence in Western North Carolina. It's really fascinating.
It is, yeah. And I'll ask you a little bit more about that after we talk about the battle. From what I remember, Tryon got together a force of several thousand men from the counties in the eastern part.
I think about 1,400.
Okay.
1,400.
Okay.
And then by the time he gets to Hillsborough and Regulators begin to gather, eventually perhaps some 2,000 farmers will show up.
Okay.
At this field in Alamance where the battle will take place. But it's pretty clear that farmers don't want to fight. They keep sending delegations to try and saying, let's talk. Surely we're not going to shoot at each other. We're all, we're all in the same colony here. But Tryon is really spoiling for a fight. He knows he's going to become governor of of New York. He wants this over with. He wants to act decisively. He wants to be able to prove to the king that he can stop this kind of unrest, and he has no interest in negotiating. He wants to defeat these guys. He's a military man himself, and he's interested in a fight, and he really is the one who starts it.
And there was another group of anti-regulars under Hugh Waddell in the western part of the state who was also trying to raise militia to come at the Regulator territory from what's now Charlotte and Salisbury, but they did not arrive at the battlefield in time. So we get to the battle, and for those folks in the audience who aren't familiar with where this is, it's roughly halfway between Hillsborough and modern Greensboro, near Burlington, North Carolina. And there is a state historical site there of the battlefield that's got great exhibits, some of which have recently been redone, so folks can get to that area. But you mentioned about the petitions in that to try to resolve this. Even when the two forces, and maybe we can pull up the map of the battlefield now to show you to show folks where the military actions were. But even when the forces got right up against each other near the Regulators' camp, there was still some parleying going on, wasn't there? Still some effort to try to avoid a shootout?
Yes, and in fact, the Regulators sent several groups of men, and the last time they sent 3 men over to, with a white flag, basically saying to Governor Tryon, can we please talk? And he takes these men hostage. And then he, at one point, there's some, we don't know exactly what happens, but he decides that one of these men will be executed. And he is shot close enough to the front that some of his Regulator friends see this happen. And then Tryon gives the Regulators an hour to disperse, but already within that hour, some of his soldiers are fighting with farmers sort of in hand-to-hand combat. I mean, this is not 2 armies meeting each other. The Regulators don't have any commanders. They ask one of their leaders, can you be in charge? And the guy goes, everybody needs to make their own decisions. So they are poorly armed. Most of them did not come thinking it was going to be a fight. So even though there's 2,000 farmers there, not very many of them are armed. And the ones who are armed, according to oral tradition, did not bring very many bullets. And even before the hour is up, Tryon gives his men the order to start firing. The battle, initially, the farmers do pretty well because Tryon's men are fighting in an orderly manner in an open field the way they're supposed to. And the farmers, of course, are hiding behind rocks and trees and sort of fighting guerrilla style. And initially, the militia has trouble aiming their cannon. The balls go over the Regulator's head. But pretty quickly, these are better trained men. They figure out how to aim their cannon, and they end up dispersing the Regulators. Some 150 men on both sides get wounded. They think about 16 Regulators are killed and about 9 militiamen. So there's loss of life on both sides. But after a couple of hours, the farmers have fled, and Tryon's forces are triumphant. And as I said, Tryon then takes a couple of people, he arrests them, he wants quick trial, so he gets that in motion, and then he takes this punitive march through the backcountry where he is requisitioning food for his troops, destroying fields, slaughtering people's hogs and cows, and generally making life very miserable. He also makes people sign a loyalty oath to the British king, even though they had never renounced the British king, and some 6,000 men end up signing that oath. And then there are these sham trials in Hillsborough where 12 men are tried and convicted to die, and in the end 6 are pardoned and 6 are hanged. And that too is a site you can visit in Hillsborough, North Carolina. It makes for an interesting day if you go to Hillsborough and then you go to Alamance, where there's not only can you see the battlefield, but there's a cabin of a sort of a typical backcountry farmer. There's really nice interpretation there. It's a good site to visit.
So I know you are very well familiar with the monument at the battlefield that says it was the first battle of the Revolution. And a long time ago, I don't know the dates or whatever, but long time ago when that monument was put up, that was the interpretation of it. So I know that the consensus these days is that that's not true. But what caused people, let's say, 80 or 100 years ago, to put up a monument and think and interpret this as the first battle of the Revolution? What was that thinking about?
Well, I actually think that that's pretty interesting, John, because on the one hand, it has to do with, I think, American discomfort about conflict. So 100 years ago, people didn't want to think about the colonial period as a period in which there was, in fact, considerable racial, but also class conflict. And the regulation is an example of that. And so by making it about the royal governor fighting colonists, it seemed like the first battle of the American Revolution. And by calling it that, you could sort of paper over that there were significant economic and social problems in the colony themselves. On the other hand, I personally think that to the extent that the American Revolution is a social movement, right? There was a famous historian, Carl Becker, who in 1909 already argued that the American Revolution was a fight for home rule, but it was also a fight over who would rule at home. And if we think about the American Revolution in part as a social movement, if we think of it as the fight over home rule, then the North Carolina regulation can be seen as the first battle of that conflict. And for many people in the Piedmont, they did not want to be active in the American Revolution. They felt like they had fought for a better world and they had been defeated and they were not going to get burned again. And large numbers leave the Piedmont and they move further south and further west, setting off new conflict with Native Americans. Many others try to remain independent in the American Revolution, aloof from either side. And other folks join either the Patriots or the Royalists, or the Loyalists. So people make different decisions, but in terms of it, the American Revolution as an idealistic movement to create a better world at home, I think, in fact, you could argue that the regulation was North Carolina's shot at that.
Very good.
So paradoxically, I think the dames of the American Revolution, who I think are the ones who, if I remember correctly, put up that monument, may have been correct in some way, even though they themselves would not have seen it that way, I don't think. Right.
I remember when I was researching North Carolina in graduate school, the early revolutionary period, the North Carolina, the new Patriot government in 1775 and 1776, and also the Continental Congress were extremely worried about which way the regulators were going to go, and dispatched some popular leaders to try to gauge which way they were going to turn during that period, just like the Highland Scots down near Cross Creek. But
Yes.
it was not considered a foregone conclusion that the former Regulator rebels were going to be now anti-British rebels.
Exactly. And part of that is because so many of the revolutionary leaders had tried to defeat the Regulators. And though after the Battle of Alamance, the new governor, Josiah Martin, tries to pass some some legislation to, make the Regulators feel a little bit better, it's too little too late. And so indeed, North Carolina patriots are very worried that they will not get a lot of support in the backcountry. And interestingly enough, initially when news of the Battle of Alamance spreads in the other colonies, many of the patriots in places like Massachusetts think that the Regulators are patriots, and they're like, whoa, these guys we should support them, this is really great. And then when some of them travel to North Carolina to visit patriot leaders on the coast trying to get an anti-British network together, and they express to these leaders like Iredell, for instance, that they so admire the Regulators, North Carolina leaders go, oh no, you guys have misunderstood that, let me tell you. And so there's a famous Massachusetts patriot who goes to North Carolina, and he writes in his diary, and he says, when I got here, I really thought those Regulators were, they were great. But then when I expressed that to Mr. Iredell, he talked to me for 3 hours. And at the end of the 3 hours, I really began to change my mind a little bit. And then in the week that he is in North Carolina, he talks to a lot of leaders. And by the end, he's like, now I understand now, these Regulators are dangerous people. So, there was a lot of uncertainty about how to characterize these folks. And the dilemmas that the North Carolina patriots face are also faced in places like Boston, where John Adams very openly says, we need ordinary people to rebel, but not so much that they'll rebel against us.
Well, we've got some questions from the audience, so let me ask you a few of these, if I might. Can you explain the difference between the North Carolina regulation and the South Carolina regulation?
Yeah, great question. They're very different movements. The North Carolina regulation is really a farmers' movement to clean up government and to create better conditions for farmers. The South Carolina regulation is really a vigilante movement of backcountry elites who worry about interracial, often, bands of poor people who move around because they don't own land, and who are seen as lawless and folks who need to be regulated. So the South Carolina regulation is really a regulation of poor people. And in North Carolina, if you want to put it that way, it's a regulation of the elites, right? So in South Carolina, it's a vigilante movement where elite men go around sort of like night riders, beating up on people whom they think are unruly. Okay. And in North Carolina, it's farmers who are trying by mostly legal and peaceful means to make their government more responsive to their needs. So very different movements.
Yeah. Okay. You had mentioned Herman Husband. Was he at the Battle of Alamance, and what eventually happened to him after the Revolution?
So Herman Husband is a lapsed Quaker. He starts out as an Anglican, I think, and then he's awakened by the famous Whitfield. When he's living in Maryland, he moves to the backcountry, joins the Society of Friends. But already before the regulation, he gets into a dispute with his local Cane Creek meeting, and he ends up leaving the Quaker movement, but he's still a pacifist. And so when it appears at the Battle of Alamance that this is going to be a military fight, which is something he's against, he leaves the battle, and a price is put on his head by Governor Tryon. He escapes, makes his way to Pennsylvania under the nickname Tuscape Death, he calls himself. He later is joined by his wife and children, and the baby that his wife has in Pennsylvania will be called Tuscape. He becomes active in similar issues in Pennsylvania, is eventually elected to the Pennsylvania legislature during the American Revolution, tries to create similar changes there, is not terribly successful, and ends up dying just a few years after the revolution is over. He's a fascinating person, a real sort of a mystic, a seeker, a religious thinker, but also a political thinker, and a man of great courage, despite the fact that people have tried to make him out as a coward because he leaves the battlefield. But I think that had to do with his religious convictions.
Mm-hmm. Is there any evidence that the British Army expected support from the former Regulators as part of their Southern strategy in the Revolutionary War?
You know, I can't really answer that question in any decisive way. I think that the Brits knew that there was that in the southern, in the backcountry in the South, the American Revolution really becomes a civil war. And that has not only to do with slavery, and of course many enslaved people who run away to the British and try to fight on the side of the British, but it also has to do with these differences between poor whites and white elites. And I think that there's no doubt that the Brits expected that there would be support in various places in the backcountry for them. If I can recommend a new book that just came out 2 days ago, that both looks at the American Revolution as a social movement, but also pays considerable attention to it as a military war, I would recommend a new book by Woody Holton called Liberty is Sweet. Mm-hmm. And he really does a fantastic job of combining the traditional story of the revolution and the military story of the revolution, for which he did a lot of research and came up with some really interesting new findings, and combined that with the new social history about what happens to women, what happens to enslaved people, what happens to poor farmers, and so on and so forth. Liberty is Sweet, great book, in addition to my own, of course.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned him because he is our monthly book talk author for March. So
excellent.
you
will enjoy him. He's a great guy.
Glad to hear that the book is good. As far as the Southern strategy, if you wouldn't mind, I can give a very brief response to that based on my work for several of my articles.
Please.
The Governor Martin was a very big proponent of trying to get the former Regulators and the large settlement of Highland Scots in the lower Cape Fear River Valley to meet up with an expedition that was being led by Sir Henry Clinton, and to be joined by regiments from Ireland under Lord Cornwallis just prior to the Battle of Moores Creek Bridge in February of 1776. And he had agents go out into the backcountry, up the Cape Fear River, the Haw River, trying to get those folks to support a military effort to crush the rebellion in early 1776. He was far more successful among the Scots than he was among the Regulators, who at this point considered that they had taken a loyalty oath to the crown, and were not about to 4 years later give that up and be accused of treason at that point. That's a very, very broad answer to that. One of our audience members also is asking an interesting question is, what happened to Governor Tryon after he left North Carolina and went to New York?
So in New York, he similarly marches an army against farmers. He brings Edmund Fanning, that hated official from Hillsborough, with him as his private secretary. And he later makes him surveyor of all of New York, which is a prime position to amass large amounts of land very cheaply for yourself. And Fanning does that. And then I don't know exactly what happens to Tryon after that. Other than that, he doesn't seem to have learned his lesson in North Carolina very well, because if he had agreed to meet with farmers, and if he had been willing to actually listen to them, and if he had been willing to see that there was graft and there was corruption, and he would have done something about it, there would have been no regulation, and there would have been no Battle of Alamance. There wouldn't have been a military campaign, there wouldn't have been loss of life, and there wouldn't have been those deep wounds that stayed in the backcountry for years and years. People felt defeated. They felt, they lost family members. They lost their farms. The wounds were deep. And he does the same thing in New York. He's not someone to admire. And of course, his whole Tryon's Palace, which we haven't even talked about, but the fact that he spent an enormous amount of money in North Carolina to build himself a big house, which became called Tryon's Palace as a snub by farmers and ordinary people who were paying for it, completely tone deaf to the fact that money was scarce, that people had trouble paying their taxes, that all this stuff was going on. He's really a sort of an arrogant, I don't have much admiration for Governor Tryon, for sure.
Good. Well, we're going to wrap it up now. I want to thank you very much for coming to be part of our program tonight, our speaker tonight. I've still learned a lot that I want to keep on this subject. But thank you very much for your time and supporting our week of colonial era conflict programs, and we're glad you were with us.
Thank you very much. And I really enjoyed it. And I hope that your audience found it worthwhile as well.
Oh, I think so. Thanks to our audience again. Thanks to our producer, Elizabeth Maurer. And again, thanks to you, Professor Kars. We enjoyed it very much.